At the end of the 19th century, the Russian Empire had arisen to the status of a great power. It was now able to exert its influence on a truly global scale, and it had built one of the largest empires in history. Yet, this imperial reach was not without its contradictions and frailty, which emerged from the crisis of modernity. The crisis of modernity led to Russia having a pronounced inability to transition into the modern age. This stemmed from its monarchy, built upon the enlightened despotism of Peter I. This so-called absolute monarchy proved to have difficulty transitioning into a modern state. Industrialism mounted, leaving the working class with a horrible standard of living. At the same time, the rising middle class with its wealth was unable to express itself politically in the enlightened despot system. These two problems would provide a seedbed of discontent to germinate throughout the Russian Empire. History has found three solutions to the crisis of modernity in the fall of the enlightened despotism. The first was liberalism, which has won out in the French and American revolutions. It promised liberty for all, but merely amounted to a slavery to oligarchic capitalism. The second, materialist socialism, which promised to erase the old order of classes and replace them with a heaven on earth where all men are equal. This was the solution the Soviet Union chose. And the glorious third solution, which wishes to take the values of the past and synthesize them with modernity, creating an ordered society built for the common man. The Russian Empire, other than the crisis of modernity, was faced with the crisis of divergent nationalisms. The Russians only made up a plurality of their empire, and to compensate for this, the state imposed Russian culture and language from above onto the other ethnicities, prompting an aggressive response, creating a ticking time bomb, which could inevitably lead to the dissolution of the Russian Empire's multinational order, for better or for worse. Foreign war became the powder keg for revolutionary fervor, and this fervor was about to overboil. In 1905, the empire was almost overthrown in the midst of its failure in its war with Japan. This was repeated yet again 12 years later in the First World War, when the Russian Empire was replaced in the February Revolution by the Russian Republic. Kerensky was then overthrown in the November Revolution under Lenin, leading to the birth of the Soviet Union. It is a liberal and socialist myth that the Tsarist regime was repressive. In actuality, it was extremely lenient towards its political dissidents, and rarely killed any at all. Despite this, thousands were dying to revolutionary terror in the years leading up to its final annihilation. This leniency allowed for the radical Bolsheviks to take hold. The Bolsheviks were defined by their violence, but this violence that they used was seldom met with execution. The dissidents who had taken up violence against the state were merely punished with foreign exile or internal exile to Siberia, or merely short-term imprisonments. The hierarchy of the revolutionary movement was then able to grow in strength, while repression amounted only to a mild nuisance, which allowed it to wait in the wings for the crisis of the First World War to reach its breaking point. Kerensky's initial Republican government became both very unpopular and was widely viewed as illegitimate. It refused to address Russia's mounting defeat in the First World War, and greatly accelerated that defeat. At the same time, it released all the mild restrictions which the Tsars had imposed upon the Bolsheviks, and sowed the seeds of its own destruction. It had only brought change for the worst, and begged for its own annihilation. It was thus overthrown in the Second Revolution of 1917, the October Revolution. This so-called Second Revolution was in reality a paramilitary coup d'etat. Lenin's theory of the vanguard party negated the classical orthodox Marxist understanding of a spontaneous class-conscious overthrow of the bourgeoisie. This class-conscious revolution emanated from the massive support from the populace. As we know, this has never occurred throughout history. Lenin argued, in contrast, that the revolution could only be conducted by a technocratic leadership. That leadership was the armed vanguard party, whose duty was to lead and educate the proletariat and force it forwards in the revolution. Lenin's pragmatic party was able to gain power not just over St. Petersburg, but in many cities throughout the Russian Republic. Prior to the coup, there was a network of Soviets or workers' councils which acted as a parallel government during Kerensky's rule. Once the second revolution occurred, the state disintegrated into total chaos. Lenin's Bolsheviks were not able to maintain control over the entirety of the former Russian Empire, and was only able to hold cities within the industrial Russian heartland. Ethnic groups and political ideologies across the former empire resisted the Bolsheviks, and a civil war broke out. These dissident movements were poorly organized. The whites were largely an incoherent force made up of a motley crew of ideologies, including moderate socialists, liberals, monarchists, and right-wing Republicans. The coherent Bolsheviks were easily able to destroy them in the war. At the same time, a Madrid of nationalities of the Russian Empire made their attempt at independence in numerous ways and with numerous strategies. Some sought alliance with the whites, others sought alliance with the reds, and others tried to make it on their own. Ultimately, Poland, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and Finland gained their independence from the Soviet Union, while the Soviet Union actually gained influence within Mongolia and made it its vassal state. Of those minorities who were not able to gain their outright independence, a compromise was made. This compromise was known as, obviously, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The Soviets could have formed, had they wanted to, a unitary socialist state based on the concept of internationalism. But they didn't. They had a national solution. So, the independent Russian, Ukrainian, Caucasian, and Belarusian socialist states united to form one Union socialist state. This compromise consisted of a dual structure. First, there was a confederation which gave a great deal of national autonomy to the various nationalities and ethnicities for their own self-determination, or at least they did on paper. The second part of this dual state structure was the unitary state of the Communist Party and its various organs. The Confederation provided a future for minorities and protected from Russification, while the Communist Party negated the incoherence of the Confederate system and unified the nation into a single entity. The Soviet Union developed a complex system of dual bureaucracies between the de jure government and the party. While the Soviet Union under Stalin, the de jure state organs and bureaucracies were little more than rubber stamps for the will of the party, whose party, the Communist Party, was synonymous with the views of Stalin. At his death, the de jure apparatus of the state began to regain its power, and while to some extent it was always subservient to the party, it slowly began to flex its wings and act independently. This is a dual system of power which exemplified the leaders of the Soviet Union being the General Secretary, aka the leader of the Communist Party, while the actual head of state, chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, being largely ceremonial. At the same time, local governments of the republics were dominated not by the Central Party, but by their own de jure organs of power, and the republics dominated by their own local communist parties, which were, of course, in league with the overall Communist Party and the overall system of state power. The tension between these parallel bureaucracies was largely non-existent prior to Gorbachev's role, because the Communist Party of the Soviet Union brought a unity to the whole system, this loose confederation. It was the mortar to the bricks of the Soviet system. But when Gorbachev began to unroot the Communist Party, he turned this authoritarian state into a weak confederation overnight. Before that, the two bureaucracies, apart from actual titles, were almost inseparable and produced an almost impenetrable fog between where one ended and the other began. Lenin, due to a series of strokes and his early death, was unable to rule the nation which he fathered. Stalin, while best positioned upon Stalin's death, and in my personal belief, his favorite successor, was certainly not in a position of unparalleled and unchecked power at that point. It took him about half a decade to come to complete dominance, and at which point he began his 5-year plans in earnest and modernized the Soviet Union into the superpower it became. But once he did, the Soviet Union was intrinsically linked to him, his will, his views, his deeds, forever, for better and for worse. Stalin's rule was one of great success, and indeed he is a contender for one of the greatest leaders of the 20th century. Yet Stalin is a source of boundless bloodshed and cruelty. The legacy of the Soviet Union will always be an extension of the person of Stalin, mirrored in brilliant success but tainted by blood. Popular understanding of Stalin's rule in the West has been shaped by the works of Robert Conquest and Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Historians who look through Stalin's rule in a glass darkly, basing their views almost entirely on the negative personal testimonies of those who suffered under him, but which do not take consideration of this brutality and oppression in context of the existential threat which that nation faced. The Soviet Union was in all sense of the phrase a rogue nation, utterly without allies and surrounded with enemies. There were no states which were allies in good faith with the Soviet Union, and all the great powers of the world were hostile to it. At times there was realpolitik with some states such as Weimar Germany or Republican China, but every interaction which they had with the Soviets was simply out of pragmatism. The isolation of the Soviet Union helped foster a strong sense of Russian and pan-Eurasian identity as an undercurrent throughout all of Soviet history. Russians are racially European, but have always been at the periphery of white civilization. This peripheral status created a unique identity and civilization which was European, but not Western. There has always been attempts by the rulers of Russia to force the nation to become Western and neglect its own independent civilizational identity. The Soviet Union's autarky and imposed global isolation provided a hard break in this trend, cementing Russian identity as something unique and non-Western. Their survival depended upon them, and it was at odds with those of the rest of the world. The Soviets found themselves industrially backwards in relation to all the other great powers and vulnerable to invasion. In fact, they considered the greatest threat to be the Polish Republic. The Confederacy made national cohesion difficult, and the new economic policy kept the country on track for agrarianism for the foreseeable future. The military was made up of czarists whose loyalty was questionable. This, coupled with the division inside the party itself, made the regime highly vulnerable. Stalin was thus beset with the task of stunning difficulty, centering, industrializing, modernizing, arming, and uniting the nation, all while enacting the radical revolutionary system of Marxism. He accomplished all of these by the onset of the Second World War, but at an immense cost of life. The rapid and unparalleled advance was built upon rivers of skulls, and the nations of the Soviet Union would likely have fallen under the sway of Hitler had another man, who was not as hard and determined as Stalin, was their ruler. The system which Stalin built was centered upon heavy industry, and was designed best for producing implements of war. A war which Leninist ideology, and Stalin personally thought, was inevitable, not just against fascist powers, but against the liberal, capitalist powers of the West as well. The centrally planned state is exquisite for heavy industry, but less than adequate for the development of light industry and agriculture. This meant that the centrally planned Leninist republics were doomed to have a lower standard of living than their capitalist opponents. Yet, conversely, they could punch high above their weight when it came to war against the rich democratic capitalist nations. Despite the inadequacy of the Soviet standard of living in material terms to its opponents, the system of socialist guarantees were immensely popular with the working class, and provided a life while deprived of material goods, it was relatively stress-free for the common man. Stalin, like Cromwell and Napoleon before him, took a revolutionary state and formed it into order. This order, while on paper was meant to enact that revolution in a coherent manner, tended to shift the great revolutionary excesses into an austere and neat society. That order formed a neo-lawfulness which emulated the previous pre-revolutionary order, but more streamlined and youthful. Thus Stalin not only fought against the sexual liberation promoted by the early Bolsheviks, but completely annihilated, enacting one of the most pro-family regimes in world history. Initially socialist and internationalist, the Soviet Union evolved into being a nationalist state, advancing the influence of the Russian nation to its greatest extent in history. The so-called Judeo-Bolshevism gave way after the Great Purge into a relatively anti-Semitic society. Its media was also centered upon Russian high culture, albeit in shades of communist influence. This was different and opposed to the mounting vulgar popular culture of the West. As the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s rolled on throughout the West, the Soviet Union and its vassal states remained resilient, and the axis of the revolutionary and reactionary party in the Cold War began to flip to where it stands today. Khrushchev ultimately succeeded Stalin and attempted to roll back much of his achievements, demonizing him and trying to return the Soviet Union to its 1917 revolutionary roots. It was most clear during his 1956 secret speech, where he explicitly denounced Stalin. Khrushchev attempted to break the Soviet Union away from the traits which Stalin had allegedly corrupted in the early leftism of the original Bolsheviks. Ironically, though, Khrushchev proved to be both an unpopular figure and a failure, and was forced out of power and replaced by Brezhnev. Brezhnev was a Stalin light. There was a great deal of nostalgia for Stalin's reign during Brezhnev, and a negative reaction towards Khrushchev's attempts at reviving a cosmopolitan understanding of communism. Brezhnev's conservative brand of communism proved popular and stable, yet the problem of central planning reared its head alongside systematic corruption. To the West, the stagnation is synonymous with Brezhnev's name. The heavy industry-focused economy continued to allow the Soviets to have the greatest army on Earth, ultimately reduced the United States to being a near peer in the nuclear arms race, become a near peer of the United States in aeronautics, and the second greatest blue water navy on Earth. Yet this was at the immense cost, as central planning at first achieves rapid growth before it eventually reaches a state of natural stagnation. The Soviet Union reached this level of stagnation in the early 1970s, and the military-industrial complex, in order to maintain its parity with the United States, had to take up greater and greater percentages of the state's total GDP. Consumer goods were not given a high level of priority within the Soviet system, so as a result, their standard of living began to lag behind that of the West. This was curtailed by a mix of cunning Machiavellianism and luck. The fuel crisis in the 1970s, coupled with massive Soviet energy surpluses, led to the exports of oil and natural gas. It was a simple system for the Soviet Union, which allowed it to increase its standard of living. Sell energy to the West for hard currency, then buy consumer goods with said hard currency, and to devote almost the entirety, or large portions at least, of the Soviet economy to its military. Eventually, the oil crisis ended, and the Reagan administration put pressure on Saudi Arabia to flood the market and artificially lower the demand worldwide for oil, putting stress on the Soviet economy to natively produce consumer goods and cut back on military spending. Simultaneously, the US increased its own military spending. There was, more importantly, ideological stagnation. Socialism is an inherently millenarian ideology. Living in the socialist reality, even in the popular guarantees, is no substitute for religion. Every year more that the socialist heaven on earth takes to be formed is yet another year which discredits socialism and leads to apathy. Men are very willing to die for God. They're willing to die for the ancestors, but they are apathetic to die for ideology, especially an ideology which discredits itself when its promises are never achieved, Even more so when those promises are supposed to be had in only a material world, and it is revealed that these material promises were vaporous all along. The vassals of the Soviet Union were liable to rebel against Soviet rule for their national sovereignty. The problem was that socialism was supposed to be a massively superior system to capitalism, and inevitable. Any return to capitalism from a socialist state debunks this inevitability and discredits the Soviet system itself. So Brezhnev was forced to maintain Soviet domination over its vassals through force. This was easy for Khrushchev in Hungary, and easy for him in Czechoslovakia, in terms of troop power and exertion of force. But it meant to maintain the empire throughout Eastern Europe, they had to maintain a constant use of force. The Soviet system was popular in the Soviet Union, save for the conquered Baltic states, but it was not popular in the Warsaw Pact. Ultimately meaning that the Warsaw Pact was a ticking time bomb. If the nations were allowed to become independent allies, some would drift to a Tito-like socialism, or even a few would return to capitalism itself. Regardless, they would discredit the Soviet Union and threaten the core of the nation, the ideology of the Communist Party, the very thing that kept the Soviet Union stable and coherent. To add insult to injury, maintaining control of the Warsaw Pact was essential to Soviet strategy. It provided the staging ground for the conflict with Marxist-Leninist ideology considered predestined by dialectical materialism. It also was essential for defending the Soviet Union from a foreign invasion by a united and hostile West. Something which had happened over and over again throughout Russian history, and despite most of the time ending in victory for the Russian people, this was always a Pyrrhic victory. The possibility of winning a conventional war, if it was maintained within Europe, against NATO was actually very high, but America could use nuclear weapons and prevent this victory through the rapid annihilation of its invading armies, and possibly destroying the Soviet homeland itself. So the Soviet Union was stuck in the stalemate throughout the Cold War, unable to attack and use its natural advantage. So the Soviet system was stuck in a stalemate throughout the Cold War. It needed to maintain its tenuous rule over Eastern Europe to win a conventional war, but it could not launch this conventional war without it turning nuclear and possibly ending both parties. So the reality of the status quo of mutually assured destruction defined the world order throughout the Cold War. As the Soviet Union waited, it was stuck in this stalemate. The natural stalemate of central planning meant that to maintain its advantage, more and more resources of its economy would be eaten up preparing for this war which never came. Brezhnev's doctrine of maintaining allies through strong arm intervention caused the Soviet Union to engage in the quagmire of Afghanistan. That nation is not a united nation internally, nor will it ever be. It is simply a nation which the great powers have drawn the borders around and encaged within the dysfunctional people who are conquerable from within or without. Once the Soviet Union intervened in Afghanistan, it found itself making the matter even worse. If they abandoned this state, they would not just suffer humiliation, they would to an extent discredit Marxism. And, even worse, they would allow radical Islamism to maintain a foothold in Central Asia and possibly spread into the Soviet Union itself. When Brezhnev finally passed away after over a decade of sickness, the Politburo and higher levels of Soviet leadership was stuck in a generational succession crisis. His two immediate successors would die within 3 years of his own death. They would leave the nation in the hands of a young Gorbachev. Because of the majority of the Soviet leadership was caught in the middle of a generational transfer, he had full power to shape the future of the nation as the preceding generation passed away. The world trained their eyes upon this relatively young man, and the Soviets pinned their hopes upon him. He inherited many problems, but it was not a crisis which by any means would mean the collapse of the Soviet Union no matter what. We have seen that he could have chosen to go along with the inertia of stagnation as Cuba and North Korea have chosen, or implement sweeping changes which would have maintained stability and increased prosperity as China and Vietnam have done. But instead, he chose impotence, cowardice, and ignorance, and proved himself to be the worst leader of the 20th century.